Hi everyone, my name's Callie and I have a creature feature for you today. I've got a few clues that I want to share with you. See if you can guess what animal this is. The first clue is I have 10 legs. Second clue, I have a long, powerful tail. Any ideas yet? Third clue, I start my life off as plankton, so that means I'm a drifter. My fourth clue is I have 2 different size claws. Any ideas? What do you think? If you guessed lobster, you are correct. I have a really cool book that I want to share with you that talks all about lobsters and how actually you go fishing for them. So come with me to the wheelhouse. Lobsters are probably one of the most well-known crustaceans, and you may have even eaten one before. Around here in Long Island Sound, their populations were once very abundant, but they have been in decline recently. In about 1999, there was a drastic decline in the population of lobsters. There was a big die-off. We haven't seen their numbers recover since that time. A lot of scientists think it has to do with warming water temperatures here. And so there are still a handful of fishermen around, but not like there used to be. When I was a little girl, I grew up lobstering and I learned from my grandfather. And it reminds me a lot of this book called Going Lobstering. The story is about 2 young kids who have an opportunity to go out on a lobster boat. So I wanted to share that with you today. The book is called Going Lobstering by Jerry Pilato and Rob Bolster. It was a beautiful day at the beach. Linda and her little brother Eric were building sand castles and looking for seashells. When they looked out at the ocean, they saw a boat, and they wondered what the man in the boat was doing. Their father came over and told them that the boat was a lobster boat and that the man on the boat was a lobster man. The lobstermen used traps to catch lobsters. After hearing all about the lobsters and lobstering, Linda and Eric asked their father if they could go out on a lobster boat someday. Their father decided to take them to their town pier to meet his old friend, Big Joe, the lobsterman. Their father told them that if they were lucky, Big Joe would take them out on the lobstering boat to check some of his traps. Big Joe thought it was a fun idea. The first thing Big Joe did was show Linda and Eric the buoys that float on top of the water and mark the location of his lobster traps. Big Joe's buoy colors were green, white, and red. As they left the harbor, Eric was hoping they would catch lots of lobsters. Big Joe told Linda and Eric to be on the lookout for his buoys. Big Joe explained how lobster traps work. The trap is baited with stinky dead fish. Then it's set on the bottom of the ocean. There is a rope attached to the trap so it can be pulled to the surface and checked for lobsters. A buoy marks the rope that is attached to the traps. Hungry lobsters are attracted by smelly bait. There are openings on the side of the trap so that the lobsters can climb in. Once the lobsters are inside the trap, it's difficult for them to get out. Linda could not believe all the buoys that she saw. Eric was amazed by all the different colors. Each lobsterman has his own color, so he knows which buoys are his. Linda was the first one to spot one of Big Joe's buoys. Eric remembered that the colors they were looking for were green, white, and red. Can you spot it up there? Big Joe grabbed his buoy. He pulled the rope through the pulley and wrapped it around the winch. He then began to pull the first lobster trap. Linda and Eric were a little afraid. They didn't know what to expect. Unfortunately, the trap did not have any lobsters in it, but it did have a flounder. Linda and Eric thought that was crazy. A lobster trap that caught fish instead of a lobster? They pulled the second trap. It had 2 broken boards. Big Joe explained that they would have to fix the broken boards so that the lobsters could not escape through the hole. The third lobster trap, they caught 10 rock crabs, but still no lobsters. Big Joe put bait on the bait hook and then threw the crabs back into the ocean. In the fourth lobster trap, they finally caught 2 lobsters. One lobster was much too small, but the other one looked big enough to keep. Big Joe showed them the special gauge that a lobsterman uses to measure a lobster. A lobster is measured from its eye socket to the end of its back. The other lobster was also too small. Before throwing the lobster back, Big Joe showed Linda and Eric how to hold the lobster. The easiest way is to pick it up by its body with one hand. Then the lobster cannot bite you with its claws or hit you with its flapping tail. In the fifth trap, they caught a very big lobster. As he picked it up, Big Joe noticed that this very big lobster had thousands of lobster eggs on its tail. Lobsters with eggs have to be thrown back into the ocean. All those little black dots that you see, those are the lobster eggs. Splash! Linda and Eric couldn't believe it. After finally catching a big enough lobster to keep, it still had to be thrown back. But it was the best thing to do. In the ocean, the eggs will hatch and thousands of baby lobsters will have a chance to grow. Linda wondered how the mother could possibly take care of so many babies. When the sixth trap was pulled from the water, Linda and Eric were scared and almost started to cry. There was a shark in the trap. It took Big Joe a long time to get the shark out of the trap. In the seventh lobster trap, they caught 2 lobsters that were big enough to keep. Now, finally, they had something they could take home to show their mother. Big Joe helped Eric put rubber bands on the claws so the lobsters could not bite anyone. Lobsters have 2 claws. One is the crusher claw, and it's strong and dull. The other claw is the scissor claw. It's sharp and it's quick. Lobsters also have 2 antennas. They have 8 legs. The first 2 on each side have little pinchers on them. They have tails that flap. One amazing thing about lobsters, when they lose one of their antenna or a leg or a claw, it can grow back. The 8th lobster trap, they caught 22 crabs, 6 small lobsters and 4 big lobsters that were large enough to keep. Claws were snapping everywhere, and Big Joe had trouble pulling everything out without getting pinched. The 9th lobster trap, no one could believe what happened. Big Joe was stunned. He had never caught a lobster this big. The lobster couldn't even get its crusher claw out of the opening of the trap. And finally, they got it out. Wow, it was almost as big as Eric. The lobster was probably as big as the biggest one anyone has ever caught. Linda couldn't wait to tell all her friends about the gigantic lobster. They pulled a few more traps and they caught 10 lobsters that were large enough to keep. They steered the boat back towards the harbor. After seeing how big lobsters can grow, Linda wanted to know what they ate. Big Joe told them that lobsters are scavengers. They eat anything that they can. Snails, fish, periwinkles, mussels, clams, crabs, even other lobsters, just to name a few examples. Eric wanted to know if lobsters eat hamburgers and french fries and pizza. Big Joe and Linda laughed. Big Joe told them to remember that lobsters eat anything. They would even eat pizza if they could find some. Soon they were at the entrance of the harbor. Linda told Big Joe that going lobstering was really fun, and Eric agreed. They were back at the pier. Big Joe was happy because he had caught the biggest lobster he had ever seen, and Linda was happy, and Eric was happy. Now all of their friends want to go lobstering too. Well, thanks for listening to that story with me. Now come into the lab and I can introduce you to a lobster in person. Come on. All right, so now it's time to meet the lobster and also the fishing gear that we use to catch it. So I'll start off by showing you how we actually catch lobsters here at Project O. This is an example of one of our traps, just like the one that you heard in the book. And so you can see that there are openings here. The lobster is able to walk right up these openings to get to, you guessed it, that stinky bait. Remember, the stinkier the better. So we've got an example of a bait bag here with some fish. We hang that right off the center of the trap into this first room. That first room in the trap is what we call the kitchen, same place where you keep your food at home, right? And then after the lobster is able to eat that food, you notice there's this sort of ramp here in the middle made out of net. So the lobster can walk up that ramp and it falls into the second room of our trap. And we call that the parlor or the living room. And so it's hard for the lobster to get back out of that ramp, and so many times they get stuck there. And so we've got an example of a lobster in that section of our trap today. I want to show you what the actual lobster looks like because they're one of my favorite animals here in Long Island Sound. Take a look at those claws. So again, you can notice that these claws are very large, and if you look closely at them, each one looks a little bit different. The one that's kind of waving at you right now is what we call the crusher claw. It's bigger, it's really good at crunching through shells or bones of this animal's prey. The one that's closest to me here is what we call the ripper claw or the tearing claw. If you look at it, it's much sharper. It's a little more narrow, so it's designed for really pulling off pieces of meat of whatever the lobster is eating. We call them scavengers, so they wouldn't pass up a free meal like the bait we have in our lobster trap. But as you can imagine, those claws are quite strong, so they can crunch through the shells of, say, a crab or the bones of a fish pretty easily as well. You notice that the tail is able to bend, and it's moving around a little bit here while we're talking. And so that tail is really designed to help the lobster to swim. And you can also see a pretty good view here of its walking legs. So you can see that it has 4 legs that help it to crawl around on the bottom as well. So if you think back to the book, do you remember the part where it talked about the female lobster having eggs underneath her tail? So for our lobster, that would be right here. When the females carry their eggs, they keep it right here so they can stay protected. When those eggs hatch, tiny lobsters are born. They look kind of like the adults, but scientists call them plankton, which means they're not very good at swimming and they're not very good at walking. So those baby plankton lobsters or larvae, they drift in the surface of the water for a couple of weeks until they're big enough and heavy enough to sink down to the bottom. Once they're down on the bottom, then they can walk and crawl around, and they try to stay in places where they'll feel protected and not eaten from other larger predators. All right, so thanks so much for meeting the lobster with me today. Make sure you try our craft. We've got a cool project where you can actually make lobster claws at home, so I hope you try that. We also have a page for you to color as well. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.